Well, greetings from Central Oregon on a foggy morning. And it was a foggy morning in Genesis chapter 11, which we're talking about today. The Tower of Babel, or Babel. The word Babel comes from the Hebrew word for gate. Bab-el, E-L, Elohim, remember that? The gate of God. It also comes from the word that is referred to as Babel, just kind of not knowing what is going on. Chapter 11 is really a transition chapter in the book of Genesis between the prehistory in Genesis 1 through 11 and then the Abrahamic story that begins in Genesis chapter 12 and the covenants that God made. God, of course, made a covenant with Noah in chapter 9, and God makes a covenant several times with Abraham in chapters 12 through about 25. It's an interesting story, and somebody asked last week at our face-to-face Bible study, said that the Genesis study that they were in said that chapter 11 was written really before Genesis chapters 1 through 10. And in my research on that, I found a couple of different references to that, just saying that it comes from one of the very earliest times. We'll see that a little bit later in the lesson. It presents a crisis, it does, chapter 11, a crisis in which God's good creation is found now at kind of the end of this prehistory before we get into the specific way in which God spoke to Abraham in chapter 12. It poses an important question about the practice and the function of language, and it suggests that all human language is the result of disobedience, and also that as we end this prehistory, it really shows again that the rebellion against God continues as it did from the first chapters of Genesis. Chapter 3, when they acted according to what they wanted instead of the command from God not to eat of the tree of the fruit in the middle of the garden, they disobeyed that. And so disobedience and rebellion, Genesis 1 through 11, is a part of who we are as people of God. Now, by way of genealogy, if you look through chapter 10 and the last half of chapter 11, this post-flood narrative traces the continuity and the interrelatedness of all of the children of of Noah that survived after the ark. God wanted them. In Genesis 1:28, God says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And they did so, and they continued to be fruitful and multiply. Their well-being is assured because God had promised that God would never again destroy all flesh, but because of these post-flood promises that God will never again destroy humanity, we really expect, the people expected then, the well-being for all of creation. So in that kind of context and in the placement of Genesis chapter 11, this kind of comes as a little bit of a surprise. Now, it's important to notice the context, because this flood story, this tower story, is here just prior to the patriarchal stories, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and it shows and suggests that the post-flood humanity is just as sinful as the pre-flood humanity. God had hoped to kind of start a new creation, but guess what? People rebelled and did what they wanted rather than what God was calling them to do. By sending the flood, wiping out humanity, God now scatters them and places his hope at the Tower of Babel. God scatters them, and God places his hope in Abraham as a powerful solution to human sinfulness. The problem in chapter 11 is that we still rebel. The solution is in chapter 12, and these two chapters are brought into juxtaposition because chapter 12 is the answer to chapter 11. So the account of the founding of this tower falls at the end If you look at chapter 10, verses 26 through 29, I'm not going to read it, but look at those chapters, because the founding of the tower falls at the end of the list of 14 names from the line of Joktan, and at the end of this list, 10 names of Peleg's line is called, and that is the account of the call of Abraham. So these two great descendants of Shem divide into the two sons of Eber. Eber, if you look through 10, chapter 26 through 29, one ends up in Babylon, the other one ends up in the Promised Land. They are divided. Eber has two sons, one Babylon, one the Promised Land. But even more, look at chapter 12, verses 6 through 12, a little bit before that. Again, I'm not going to read that. Chapter 10, verses 6 through 12, notice that there's Nimrod there. Nimrod says, Nimrod's name comes from the verb, let us revolt. Nimrod, if you read chapter 10, verses 6 through 12, is a mighty warrior. But in the Jewish writings around that came years and years after that, the name of Nimrod as a mighty hunter, his name starts to get much more dark. Instead of saying he's a mighty hunter, they said in the Jewish writings that he was a hunter of the souls of people. Remember Cain, the condemned murderer who started the cities before the flood? Now Nimrod is the one who builds the first post-flood city. Nimrod, Cain, there's a little bit of a connection there. A destroyer or a killer of the souls of people. Nimrod builds the first post-flood city, and the region he settles in is now the modern Iraq. Nimrod is a little bit of a mysterious figure, but he is, if you read there, Nimrod is both the founder of the cities of Babylon and Nineveh, the two great cities of antiquity which were the enemies of Israel. Nimrod was a king, however, at this time when civilization was sparse, but it was spreading, wild animals continued to be a threat to the people. And so what kings would do is that they would organize hunting parties as a way of protecting their people from the wild animals. So Nimrod was the first warrior on earth, remembering the mighty man of God. Remember then Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God who married daughters of men, men of renown, like Nimrod, like the Nephilim in chapter 6. And so the rebellion continues, a rebellion against God. So notice in there too some of the Hamites. Remember Ham, who saw his father's nakedness? We talked about that a couple weeks ago. The Hamites migrated east. Remember Canaan, who was cursed, to the plains of Shinar, and it's when the people move east that they leave the land of blessing, Eden and the Promised Land. When they go to the east, they go to a land where the greatest of their hopes would soon turn to ruin in the east. Babylon and Sodom and Nineveh. Their motivation for building this tower, that's my cat behind me. Their motivation for building this tower was to make a name for themselves. Notice how later God would make a name for Abraham. God says, I will make your name great. God is the one who names in the Old Testament. God changes Abram's name to Abraham, Sarai's name to Sarah. Jacob, Israel, you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins, is what the angel of the Lord said. Naming confirms or confers identity. Notice how the man in Genesis chapter 2 and 3 names all of the animals, and whatever he would name them, that was its name. In naming them, he gave them identity. Adam named Eve, giving her an identity. We are made children of God by our names that are spoken at our baptisms, as a sign of the cross is made on our foreheads. And as the words are spoken, you are marked with the cross of Christ and sealed with the Holy Spirit forever. That makes us children of God, and that is enough. That is any much of an identity that any one of us needs. You are a child of God. That is your identity. Think for a moment. When is being a child of God not enough for you? When is being a child of God not enough for you? Do you find yourself worrying about all kinds of things that over which you have no control, and you find out worrying about them, and you want to control your future, and you want to, of course, planning is good. 1 year, 2 year, 5 year plans are all good. I do those, you should do them, they're all good. But when is being a child not good enough for you? God has named you at your baptism. God has chosen you. God has set you apart. God has saved you. When is that not enough? Maybe during the building of the Tower of Babel, God was teaching them, or they learned that lesson, that having the name that God gave to them is enough. Is enough. Maybe God used the Tower of Babel to teach them that being a child of God, being a chosen people of God, is enough. Sometimes I think that God puts us in situations where God wants to teach us about things. I think God wanted to try to teach Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the family and the people at the Tower of Babel. God wanted to teach them trust. Trust that being God's child, being named and claimed by God, is enough. That's what God does to Abraham, and we'll see next week how Abraham gets this covenant from God, and then immediately he goes out and screws it up. I mean, it's utterly fascinating. When is being a child not enough for you? Sometimes I truly believe that when God is trying to teach us something, God puts us in the opposite context about which God is trying to teach us. So when God is trying to teach us about patience, God doesn't just set us by the river with a fly casting and go back and sit and fry some fish on the beach and say, oh man, it just don't get no better than this. If God's trying to teach you patience, God puts you at the DMV at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with all of town also there. When God is trying to teach you peace, God doesn't just surround you in the mountains and fields and streams. When God is trying to teach you peace, God puts you on the freeway at 5 in the afternoon, which is just jam-packed. When God is trying to teach these people about trust, the early people and us, God is trying to say, being my child is enough. Being a child of God is enough for you. You need to trust. Think of those times in your life when being a child of God just isn't enough. Maybe through that, God is trying to teach you trust. Trust to rely on God, being a child of God, that God will be with you no matter what, that neither angels, principalities, none of that, ain't nothing ever going to separate you from God's love. Trust when you find yourself in the opposite position of a lesson that God may be trying to teach you. We'll talk about that in our lesson. So, people wanted to make a name for themselves and ascend into heaven by this great big tower, but instead, notice how God comes down to them. Let me read those first 9 verses of chapter 11. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there, and they said to one another, "Come!" That's going to be an interesting word. "Let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. A little bit comment about that. Rather, we'll talk about that. Then they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." God's name isn't good enough. Let's make a name for ourselves. Being a child of God, it just doesn't cut the mustard. Let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, this anthropomorphic view of God, where that mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they're one people, and they have all one language, and this will be the only beginning of what they will do. Nothing will be that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us." Remember in Genesis 2, 2, when God said, let us create man in our image, in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. There's a plural, us. We talked about that in one of the early lessons. Let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them. Notice, the Lord doesn't destroy it, but God scatters them from there over the face of the earth. And they left off building the city. Therefore it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Fascinating. God comes down to see this great tower that they were building with their top in the heavens. Interestingly, tower stories are common across civilizations. Let me just mention a few. Like the flood we talked about are common through many civilizations. There are also many stories of a tower, post-flood towers, in civilizations. Like in Central America, Zelua was one of the 7 giants who was rescued from the deluge and built a great pyramid of Cholula in order to storm heaven. The gods destroyed it with fire, destroyed it, and confused the language of the people. There was a Dominican monk who reported hearing this in a book that he wrote in the 1550s after he visited with a 100-year-old priest in Cholula shortly after the conquest of Mexico in 1550. The ancient Toltecs also has a story about the same time, saying that people multiplied after the flood and they built a tower to save themselves from the flood. In this story, in a Toltec story, they built a tower in order to get up, so they wouldn't have to build an ark to get up from the flood that might be happening. And again, their languages were confounded in order to be sent to separate places of the earth. In another story attributed to the American Tohono Indians, I think it's American, holds that Montezuma escaped a great big flood and then became wicked and attempted to build a house reaching into the heavens, but the Great Spirit destroyed it with thunderbolts. According to David Livingstone, the African missionary, the Africans that he met near Lake Ngami in 1849 also had a similar tradition, but the builders' heads, as they were building this African tower, started to get cracked when the scaffolding fell. In 1918, there was a Scottish social anthropologist, Sir James Fraser, who documented some of these Old Testament stories with legends and myths from around the world, and he identified David Livingstone's account with the tale that's found in Lozi mythology, where people build a tower to the creator god Niambi, who fled to heaven on a spider web, and people, of course, collapsed then as they were building this tower after it was built. There's also stories similar to this attributed to the tribes in Nepal and northern India from a book in 1872. But the Tower of Babel account is not the end of early Genesis, because if it were the end of early Genesis, the story would just end on a sad note of human failure. Instead, the story continues with the obedient Abraham, who was also found in the region of Shinar. We'll look at him next week. Fascinating that he came from pagan parents, and God called him and blessed him and made a covenant with him. Without the blessing of God, of Abraham, the situation of humanity would be without hope, and this is a central thrust of the opening chapters of Genesis. So, looking at the genealogy, in contrast to the genealogy in chapter 5, the table of nations in Genesis 10 and the last half of Genesis 11 emphasize life and expansion rather than death, even though the numbers of years that they live are declining. This new genealogy begins with Noah's son Shem, whom God blessed, and it concludes with Abram, whom God continues and promises to bless. This is a line of Israel's descendants and ancestors, and it's a vertical line used in the Near East to document legitimate claims to the thrones or inheritances of property. The purpose of this genealogy is to connect Adam to Noah and to give background information which is important for understanding the story and the covenants with Abram. So with the genealogy, think about this. If you count all of the descendants from Noah, listed by name in Genesis 10, you get 15 names for Japheth's descendants, 30 for Ham's, 27 for Shem's. That adds up to 72 as the number of languages that result from the confusion at Babel, although that number has varied over time, especially in the intertestamental times, to be 70 or 72. It varies between 70 or 72. Many sources throughout early Christendom mention 70 or 72 as far as the numbers, from about the 600 AD to about the 1200s. All of the different languages were 70 to 72. Now, the reason I say that is because if you turn to Luke chapter 10, Luke chapter 10, Luke has this expansive theology about who Jesus is, starting from very humble beginnings and going to the ends of the earth. Read through Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. You'll see that when Jesus sent out his disciples, he sent out 70, although some ancient manuscripts, if you look in the footnotes, send out 72, 70 or 72, to all nations, all the different languages. Luke adopts that numbering from Genesis chapter 11, 70 or 72, because you'll see that in the footnotes. And notice when they go out and preach the word of God, they see Satan falling from heaven. Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. Their names are written in heaven, Jesus says. Your name, I will name you, and your name is written in heaven. You'll see that in Luke chapter 10. Your name is written in heaven. You are a child of God. Trusting God because you're God's child is enough. Is enough. Is enough. Just trust. In times of difficulty and challenge, trust. Being a child of God is enough. So also, the confusion of languages that happens in the Tower of Babel is also reflected in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 20. Read through that too. We'll look at that in our face-to-face Bible study. The story of the Pentecost, where the Spirit of God comes and alights on them, and they all understood one another. There was this common language of these people that had been dispersed at the Tower of Babel, now are brought together with the Spirit of God when it alights on them. And they also say, not only are the people speaking in different languages, but we hear in our native tongues. We hear them speak of the mighty words of God. On that day when the Spirit of Pentecost was poured out, they heard the apostles in their own language, and the Nimrod, the mighty acts of Nimrod, are undone by the mighty act of the Spirit of God, reversing what happened at the Tower of Babel. Interestingly is that they hear, not only that people speak the different languages, but they hear in a common language. Hearing is a lost art these days. A political campaign and so many other things, church sandboxes where all we do is find out which sandbox the other person is in, and the only thing we have to result to when we find out which sandbox they're in is to throw sand at them rather than listening and trying to understand what is going on and their point of view. We tend to throw sand. People don't listen anymore. People don't listen. At the Spirit of Pentecost, they heard, they listened. I think that's an important lesson for us today. Thanks for listening. The solution to all of this is found in Genesis chapter 12 with the calling of Abraham and Sarah, who God promised through them to bless all of the families of the earth, and that they will be blessed as the sand on the seashore and as the stars in the sky. Through Abraham and Sarah's lineage there would come someone who doesn't have to make a name for himself. Instead, Jesus will honor the name that God has given to him as the one who will save his people from their sins. Who will save his people from their sins. And so the Tower of Babel, the cross, the gate of God, Babel, the Tower of Babel becomes the cross. In the New Testament, it becomes a cross where God meets our greatest defiance, our greatest rebellion, and makes the cross now the gate toward which we have access to God as children of God who are having our names written in heaven. A lot of stuff in this lesson, some good things to read through. I look forward to seeing you next time when we look at Genesis chapter 12 and the calling of Abraham and Sarah and the blessing of all of creation. Take care till then. Bye-bye.